Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Julie Stoner. I'm with Friends of the Montana Historical Society group. And I would like to introduce today Anthony Wood. Anthony has worked as a historian at various stages of Montana's African American Heritage Places project. He is also the author of Black Montana, Settler Colonialism, and the Erosion of the Racial Frontier. Anthony is a graduate of Carroll College and Montana State University and is currently completing his PhD at the University of Michigan. His dissertation, 40 Years Within the Veil, is a study of myth and memory making in the new black towns of the Rocky Mountain West from the 1870s to the 1920s. Please make sure your cell phones are silent, and join me in welcoming Anthony.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Martha and Historical Society for having me again. Kind of as a way of introduction, getting into this talk, which I've had the fortune of giving a few times, and I've really enjoyed it. I like it particularly because it has kind of one foot in the book, and then another foot in this other project, and in many ways, I think it gives me a lot of opportunity to talk about things that I'm still working on, but also any questions that come up generally about Black history in Montana. I feel like it also kind of usually facilitates those questions as well. So at the end of the talk, literally anything that if you think of, if you have any questions, you can ask about, because as the talk goes, it kind of tends to focus a little bit, but don't let that kind of quarter you off from asking any questions that you might have more generally. So I'm just going to begin. I've had kind of some prepared statements, and from time to time, I have some new things that I'll just like back up and interject with. But for the most part, I'll just kind of get into it. So, all right. Given the national attention on the rise of Jim Crow and the segregation of public transportation following Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, it is hard to imagine how the Silver Bow County train depot would not have become something of a spectacle on the morning of August 4th, 1902. Over 100 eager passengers crowded the platform, many of them clutching picnic baskets and fishing poles. Children could not contain their excitement about the festivities to be held later, but the journey into the mountains may very well have been the most highly anticipated moment of the day. Elsewhere in the country, these Black youngsters and their families would have been forced to peer out from crowded, colored-only cars, typically located uncomfortably close to the dirty and loud coal-fire engines. But they were in Montana, not Mississippi, and on Emancipation Day 1902, Butte's Black community had chartered several cars to take them up over the Continental Divide and into the mountains. When the group reached their destination, they took to a large meadow alongside Boulder Creek, now a renowned fly fishing destination, and began preparations for their annual Emancipation Day picnic. Foot races and other competitions capped the festivities. Young Roy Parsons edged out his challengers in the children's sack race, which secured him the prize of a baseball bat. 24-year-old Ida Willis took the honors in the women's division of the 100-meter sprint, and the speedy Geo Symington won the men's race. For his effort, and apparently to temper his chances at winning again the next year, he received 1 box of cigars. The reporter likewise noted that the ball game between the fat men and the lean was 8-1 in favor of the lean, and Reverend Jordan Allen of Schaefer's Chapel punctuated the gathering with an address on Emancipation Day before everyone climbed aboard the excursion train once more and returned to the smoggy evening air of Montana's mining city. Emancipation Day picnics such as this one, recorded by Butte's local Black newspaper, The New Age, which you can see here on the right is a clipping of it, were common annual events in many Black communities throughout the western United States and Great Plains. By the 1920s and the 1930s, however, the popularity of August 4th had been eclipsed by commemorations of Juneteenth, which marked the emancipation of enslaved persons in Texas after the surrender of the Confederacy. While Juneteenth eventually became the dominant summertime celebration of Black freedom in America, the lesser-known Emancipation Day of August 4th carries no small amount of intrigue, and I think exposes a complex portrayal of the Black experience in the American West at the turn of the century. These auspicious gatherings can illuminate many aspects of the past, including the intimacy of racial ideologies and regional identity in the West, Black community formation at the turn of the century, and even, and oddly, an explicit shared native Black history that spanned centuries. The task before us today is to consider the memories and meanings of emancipation for Black Montanans and other Black Westerners in the early 20th century. Our own collective and popular memory of the West, I think, can sometimes erode our historical knowledge in unexpected ways. If, for instance, you have already noted to yourself that Emancipation Day isn't even in August, then you have just experienced what I call settler memory at work. Indeed, more than one layer of it. If, in fact, perhaps only a handful of historians today could speak to the original meaning of August 4th. Their history is one that we have more or less forgotten, though forgetting might not be the right term. Accounting for this collective amnesia requires us to demystify how early Black Westerners themselves conceived of and remembered August 4th. As we will see in just a moment, what exactly this merry cohort was celebrating in the mountains of western Montana and why they continued to mark the 4th may well have been only slightly more clear to them in 1902 than it remains for us today. If you did know, however, that August 4th, 1865, commemorated the emancipation of enslaved people held by the Creek Nation in Indian Territory, which, since a recent Supreme Court decision determined it was never legally dissolved, remains much of eastern Oklahoma, I would suggest that even this historical knowledge on its own may not be sufficient to fully prescribe meaning to the gatherings that took place deep in the northern Rocky Mountains during the first decades of the 20th century. So, for the next little bit, wrangle my microphone. So for the next little bit, I will attempt to peel back some of these layers of our settler memory, why it is that events that themselves are memorials and intended to keep certain memories alive become so fully erased in our contemporary memory, what I think we discovered is not only a fuller and more textured history of the American West and Montana, but a story that can help us better understand the experiences of Black settlers and the complicated history of U.S. colonialism that they carried with them. So, before we turn to that particular story, I want to briefly pause and note some of the broader implications of this project, where I come from, why I've arrived at talking about these events. I came to study Emancipation Day celebrations through an ongoing debate, actually, among historians and scholars about how we depict and particularly how we write about Black Westerners in the context of U.S. Western expansion and colonialism and the colonization of indigenous lands and peoples in the era after the Civil War. How do we make sense of the lives and experiences, like those residents in Butte, which were part of emerging societies and states whose economic, cultural, and political foundations were built upon the ongoing projects of indigenous dispossession? The question remains, can Black migrants be colonizers in the American West, even as they were subjected to the violence of internal colonialism, or does the condition of being a racialized other in this system remove their stories from our consideration of the history of U.S. colonialism? So I'm actually quite keen on keeping this part of the talk, despite it being the section where I know a lot of people's eyes kind of glaze over. It is because I think it is actually important to allow the space for these ideas and terms like settler colonialism, indigenous dispossession, and even racial ideologies. I think we need to have the space to allow them to become part of how everyday people can think about and know the world around them. As a matter of fact, these ideas are actually quite widespread in other settler societies like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And the use of these terms in everyday language have been important parts of the reconciliation projects and movements that have been taking place in those countries over the past few decades. So at this point, I would plug there is a new book out from the scholar Margaret Jacobs called After 100 Winters, which really gets into this entire conversation really well, and I would highly suggest it. Back to the question of the Emancipation Day celebrations, these questions about the roles of Black settlers within settler society, though, have raised a lot of questions in recent years, as scholars scholars continue to investigate how colonial states operate and persist in our world. Answers, however, have come rather slowly. What has become clear, though, I would argue, is that to take either the position that African Americans were fully implicated in settler colonization, or fully exempt from those processes, actually relies upon a flattened version of African American history in the West. Indeed, Ty Miles, one of the historians at the forefront of this debate, has rightly suggested that our only viable path forward remains to acknowledge that Black Westerners lived far more complicated and even contradictory lives than we typically present in our historical writing. One vein in the scholarship of the Black West, which the historians Quintar Taylor and Herbert Ruffin have variously called out as the contribution school or the we were here narratives, these are emblematic of the flattening of Black Western history. So to move beyond the we were here version of the Black West and to engage Black history meaningfully with studies of colonialism, I think we must first invent or rediscover a new way of telling their stories. For the present moment, I find myself engaged in a project of rediscovery rather than invention. That is, by taking the dynamism, complexity, and contradictions of Black life in this time and place seriously, that history might yet yield some answers to these uncomfortable and perplexing questions. As it happens, I can think of no better place to begin an examination of the complexity and contradictions than Butte, Montana. This account of the Butte Emancipation Day picnic is the fullest of any I have found in my scourings of Western newspapers. In many ways, it reveals that the celebration was something of a community institution, one that I would venture to guess was a highly anticipated annual practice, despite its absence in other archival sources. Yet, if this was the only piece of writing that you encountered about the Black community of Butte, you might be easily misled. What is not immediately evident is that this very community was in the midst of a bitter and hard-fought political campaign that saw party lines, and I put party in the biggest square quotes possible, that saw party lines split the allegiances of the Black community as the local elections of 1902 approached. I write in great detail about this moment in my book, but a quick recap should suffice for our purposes here. In the 2 years following Marcus Daly's death and control of his Anaconda Copper Company, and the fight to control his Anaconda Copper Company led to an unstable political world and a widening ideological gap between the remaining Copper Kings, William Clark and Augustus Heinze. What came to be known as the Battle for Butte hopelessly scattered and confused any semblance of party lines or affiliations among the city's voters. This confusion, I really don't think, can be overstated. Both men were nominally Democrats, which split Butte's predominantly labor-oriented electorate. Republicans in the state also reluctantly split allegiances between the two men as the true Republicans faded into banality. To further muddy the waters, and in order to offer different candidates for offices than those backed by Clark, Heinze began running men as Republicans after 1901, though he himself remained a Democrat. Tellingly, local papers generally ceased identifying candidates by party altogether, and instead they advocated for either the Clark ticket or the Heinze ticket, despite, of course, neither man was running for any office in Butte. Sensing a moment of political potential, a number of Black men and women of the city conspired in what they called a political plot to assert the power of the Black ballot through the creation of a newspaper. Let's see if I can get this to, there we go. So this is John Duncan. Among them were John Duncan, a local barber and eventually Butte's first podiatrist, and Chris Dorsey, who was the personal valet to none other than Augustus Heinze. Nationally, Black voters were still seen as an unassailably Republican bloc, but as we might well imagine, the party of Lincoln was quite impossible to discern in a contest that was almost entirely centered on local issues, union independence, and judicial appointments, and did not really seem to be much at all to do with national race politics. Thus, the New Age began in the spring of that year as a community paper devoted to voicing the issues that mattered to African Americans in the city and to consolidate the Black vote for whatever candidate, Republican or Democrat, was attentive to their concerns. It proved more difficult than they had anticipated. Not even the two main editors of the paper managed to agree. Dorsey stumped for his employer, Heinze, while Duncan and Smith, who was another editor early on in the paper's history, began endorsing Democratic candidates by September. The New Age also reveals that the black residents of Butte fiercely debated and disagreed on some of the ongoing issues facing black social politics nationally. Arguments concerning whether higher education and political agitation was the most prudent way to uplift the race, or if industrial education and the accumulation of capital should be emphasized over civil liberties, filled the minutes of local literary clubs and other social organizations. This wider context merely speaks to an unexpected complexity in the lives of the black residents of Butte. It is not entirely surprising, therefore, that if we assume that this community's gathering in the mountains above the city on August 4th, 1902, was an uncomplicated and simple celebration of black freedom, we would again be wrong. How the black community of Butte came to board the train that morning has its own complicated and contradictory history. It begins with the emancipation of enslaved people from bondage on August 4th, 1865. Abraham Lincoln had been dead for almost 5 months. The Emancipation Proclamation took effect 2 years earlier, on January 1st, 1863, when most African Americans across the country celebrated Emancipation Day. Yet thousands of enslaved blacks living in Indian Territory still eagerly awaited news of their freedom. On August 4th, 1865, the Loyal Creek Council formally declared that the African Creeks would be considered full citizens of the Creek Nation. Attesting to the full civic and tribal incorporation of the freedmen, the day became a lasting marker of inclusion and equality on the Great Plains. African American communities in Indian Territory celebrated annually with picnics, dances, and other summertime festivities. Much has been written on black Indian slavery and emancipation, but these celebrations that took place both within Indian Territory and throughout the country over the next 6 to 7 decades have passed as remarkably insignificant to most historians. In such commemorative gatherings, though, we find an opportunity to think about the complexity of freedom in settler society, as well as how and why some histories become inoperative while others become enshrined in our collective memory. We might rightly ask then, how did such memories become inoperative? From 1865 to 1887, August 4th celebrations seem to have been more or less straightforward in their meaning. Over 6,000 persons of African descent lived within the boundaries of the Seminole, Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek nations after the Civil War. Commonly known as the Creek Freedmen, these black Indians were soon joined by thousands of new black settlers arriving from the South, who likely also began commemorating August 4th. Known to history as the Exodusters, tens of thousands of Southern blacks migrated to the eastern and central Great Plains and Indian Territory as greater Reconstruction came crashing down after 1877. These newcomers established towns and neighborhoods across the region, frequently coming in contact, marrying, and building communities with black Indians and their children. While most African Creeks culturally identified as Indian, many of the new black settlers decidedly did not. And in the midst of these quickly shifting social conditions, August 4th celebrations continued during the late 1870s and 1880s, despite many of the new participants having far fewer connections to its original meaning. Moreover, they would have had a very different conceptualization of their own place within the broad history of emancipation. Thus, the meaning of August 4th, I think we can see, slowly began to change. Much like how Juneteenth is now celebrated across the country, and not just in Texas, where it began, many black Americans elsewhere embraced August 4th as a holiday. It may have reminded themselves and members of the white community that emancipation should mean total civic inclusion. Especially by the 1880s, African Creek emancipation stood in stark contrast to the conditions unfolding in the U.S. South. Scholars have argued that Creeks were the most progressive in their treatment and incorporation of former slaves, at least for a while. Voting, schools, and other social services were open to black Indians to a greater degree than any of the other 5 nations. Settler colonial logics, however, would strain the meaning of this celebration of social inclusion even further. As black migration to Indian Territory increased, the influx of non-Indian settlers inflamed tensions between the 5 nations and black Indians. While disagreements over land and tribal participation persisted throughout the 1880s, the mostly peaceable relations symbolically came to a head in 1887 when Congress passed the infamous Dawes Allotment Act. Debates around the future allotment of these procedures, future because the 5 tribes were exempted in the original language of Dawes and later would be allotted under the Curtis Act. Debates about these allotment procedures in the Creek Nation now also included those Creek freedmen and freedwomen who had been emancipated more than 20 years earlier. Many Creeks, however, not only questioned if all the freedmen listed on the Dawes Roll were truly Creek, but some even opposed any black Indians receiving allotments regardless of their standing with the tribe. This moment was exceedingly complicated, and by no means did all Creeks hold the same views. What was clear, however, was that the colonial pressures of the allotment procedures intensified the unresolved status of African Americans who made their homes on Indian lands. From here, it is not entirely surprising then that many historians believe August 4th likely slowly faded from popular black culture by the end of the century, and it was confined only to those small communities which retained the deepest ties to their African Creek heritage. How then do we make sense of the celebrations? Oops, sorry. Go to my next slide. How then do we make sense of the celebrations that continued for decades after the original meaning appears to have faded? Of possibilities. Quote, further east, editor Joseph Bass wrote in the Montana Plain Dealer, from here in Helena, quote, this season is the beginning of Emancipation Day celebrations anywhere from August 1st to August 10th, he said. Indeed, celebrations back east more often were held on either the 9th or, more commonly, August 1st. The latter date marked the day in 1834 when the British formally abolished slavery in the West Indies. White and black papers alike noted with curiosity that the picnics and parades in their cities were not, as one might assume, at all connected to the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln. This widespread ambiguity seems to have been a point of annoyance for some. Quote, in fact, Joseph Bass stated again, quote, no day in August has any significance to the abolition of American slavery, but applies only to the gradual emancipation of slaves in the West Indies. The only days that are really emancipation days for the American Negro are September 22nd and January 1st, end quote. Penned in 1910 by a newspaper editor who had cut his teeth in Topeka and Kansas City, Bass nonetheless seemed unaware of African Creek emancipation. Notwithstanding, his paper in Helena, Montana, continued to run advertisements for August 4th celebrations over the next several years. Here we can observe an interesting trend in many early black newspapers. Back east, as Bass noted, Emancipation Day was usually observed on the 4th, but on the Great Plains and in the American West, Emancipation Day was nearly always celebrated on the 4th. The latest example of a 4th celebration, which I just recently found, came from the Federal Writers Project report from Pocatello, Idaho, where a white author, in the midst of a truly horrendous and racist scree against the black Pocatellans of her city, casually mentioned that the entire community came out every year for a picnic on August 4th. That was almost 1940, more than 70 years after the original date. The WPA writer didn't suggest a reason for that particular day, but a paper in King County, Washington, mused on this oddity before dismissing the observance of the 4th as, quote, merely the usual custom. Perhaps it was more than a simple oddity or some other randomness. Butte had only a single black newspaper during the summer of 1902, which contains the most detailed account of August 4th I have found thus far. The black paper in Helena in 1908, 1910, and again in 1911 included ads for their community's upcoming August 4th celebrations. In Denver, August 4th excursions left the 5 Points train station into the mountains every year from at least 1910 until 1918, demonstrating both the material investment in the holiday as well as the neighborhood's pride and status as a black trolley car suburb. The Denver Star and the Colorado Statesman, both black papers, also reported on black communities in other Rocky Mountain towns holding their own picnics. Each and every year, from Albuquerque to Tacoma, the black press advised their readers to mind their upcoming plans and to, quote, keep off the 4th. So, pulling on this thread, I think, exposes many different layers of settler memory at work. It can remind us first that Montana and Butte were home to vibrant black communities at the turn of the century. It also points to questions we should investigate about how memory and commemoration work to make certain histories disappear. Less than 50 years after emancipation, its significance already seemed unclear in the minds of many who commemorated an event with the same name and on the same day. We can see where and when, maybe, the origins of August 4th fell away, but why would a common black Indian heritage be subject to this selective forgetting? Was it merely the power of tradition that kept the 4th alive for so many years in spite of its limited cultural appeal? If so, then why not elsewhere in the country as well? And perhaps most importantly, was this partial commemoration doing some kind of work for black Westerners who were struggling to make their home in the West? I argue that these types of histories suggest that a framework of the black settler and the black settler within American colonization should not be evacuated just yet. Grappling with these questions requires our analysis not just to attend with the experience of blackness within settler colonialism, it also requires us to ask how the black settler experience itself might have taken shape at different moments as black newcomers confronted their own complicated past and present on the ancestral homelands of indigenous peoples in the West. I think it can help us articulate how settler logics shape collective remembrances. By the 20th century, pervasive ideologies of native elimination redirected the collective memory of black settlers away from a shared Indian heritage toward other emancipatory narratives. In Butte, Montana, their August 4th picnic in 1902 was more than a vaguely conceived connection to the past or an opportunity to enjoy the summer weather, though it was those things also. It was a series of performances of home and belonging, where black celebrants in the early 20th century looked to the West as a space where they might realize the hope of earlier generations who first carried their sovereignty with them. Beneath the steep forested slopes and canyon walls of the Boulder River Valley, Butte's black residents found both the space to stretch their legs in foot races and baseball games and to breathe the fresh air as they fished or prepared other food. Their use of public outdoor spaces illustrates that the black community's participation in an emerging wilderness ethic that was foundational to the ideology of the Progressive Era's conservation movement was also ongoing. And beyond this connection to the natural world, they also found the space to, quote, stretch their souls, as W.B. Du Bois might have put it, as they sang hymns and prayed before the Reverend Allen of Schaefer's Chapel in Butte gave a short address on the significance of their conspicuous gathering. So perhaps Reverend Allen knew the origins of the holiday. Like many African Methodist Episcopal ministers of his day, he had traveled widely and worked extensively throughout the American West and the Great Plains, meeting all kinds of people and hearing their stories. But the fact that the paper did not record any of his words might suggest that the shared black Indian heritage of August 4th had also remained buried that day. The tensions on display in this moment, whether it was the black community's political engagement or otherwise, are certainly complex and riddled with differences that set it apart from the standard narratives of either novel black contribution to the colonial narrative or the narrative of black banality to Western history in general. I have no doubt that a renewed and generative debate about the language that we use will continue to produce a greater explanatory power for understanding the settler colonial present. To seek out that complexity in the past, however, is to find that black settlers confronted and challenged certain expectations as they made their own claims to home and belonging. And like those claims made on August 4th, 1902 in the mountains of Montana, they had a history, and that history was not uncomplicated. Thank you. And I'll say, just as I finish up, we have very few photos of kind of summertime emancipatory celebrations. These are from the Denver area, and that there's a kind of a prominent African-American owned camp that's there today. It started out as a subdivision called Lincoln Hills, where kind of more affluent members of the Black community from across the Front Range purchased large tracts of land and built kind of sumptuous cabins and lodges. And these are their Juneteenth, but also an August picnic, which I found, which I haven't been able to determine if it's August 4th. So, yeah.
Hi. Excuse me. If anyone has any questions for Anthony, I will bring them a microphone because we would like our online participants to be able to hear your questions as well.
Hi, thank you for that. I'm wondering about whether the Black community in Butte was able to wrest any, I don't know, accommodation or something good from either the Heinze ticket or the Clark ticket, whether they were able to use that voting power that they were hoping to use.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting puzzle, because it's difficult to tell exactly what kind of concessions were possibly made. So there are, on one level, the undeniable fact that Heinze employed Chris Dorsey, took him all over the world as his assistant, opened up lots of opportunities for him in an individual sense. There is also the fact that right as this paper was publishing, it was being published from the basement of Schaefer's Chapel, which is on the kind of the uptown just to the west of Montana Avenue. And when they were building the church in 1902, kind of refurbishing it, William Clark donated a sum of money to refurbish the windows, the stained glass, new pews, stuff like that, which kind of fits into Clark's kind of pattern of using what he imagined as like patronage gifts to the Black community, or at least attentive, and kind of throwing some money at questions in order to get any vote possible, which we see in the publishing of the Colored Citizen, the Black newspaper from 1894, which advocated for Helena as the capital, which was funded by William Clark. And if you read that paper kind of critically, you quickly realize that it is more or less just boosterism with a slightly racial spin, and it terminates in the week of the election. So he never really intended it to be a Black newspaper for the community. It was really just his own mouthpiece. I think it's interesting that, one, we should recognize that both these incredibly wealthy, powerful men seem to be paying attention to what could only have been at the most 200 or 300 voters. But they paid attention to everyone voters. These were incredibly contested elections. I think that one of the things that becomes pretty clear reading the content of the paper from mostly John Duncan's perspective, and then a lot of the editorializing that takes place into September toward the election, is that he is very concerned about the kind of the abject isolation of Black workers from other workers within Butte. And his goal is to try and put forward a kind of a unified voting bloc, not only to get William Clark, who he ends up advocating for his candidates, to offer some concessions, but I think he's also very keen on trying to get unions, which are in a very difficult place in 1902. It's not the heyday of union independence in any conceivable way. There's a lot of company oversight and control of unions, and I think he's trying to send out an olive branch and kind of offer a certain kind of solidarity. And he does so by challenging, at least John Duncan does, by challenging Augustus Heinze's attempted judicial takeover of all the city and county courts in Butte. These are during the days in which they've started underground digging horizontally between claims, trying to extract ore from each other, and it's not totally clear if that's legal or where to draw lines beneath the surface that are on the surface. Heinze really does successfully engage in a takeover of the judiciary, which essentially gives him free range to do whatever he wants below the surface. John Duncan and many other residents in Butte African-American members of the community look at this and are really wary of someone who is brazenly trying to control the courts. This is less than 10 years after the famous William Woodcock ruling, in which William Woodcock was a black man who sued for discrimination in a Butte restaurant and won $500 in damages under the 1875 Civil Rights Act. So there was this kind of this space in Butte that the independence of the court seemed to be kind of actually functioning in a real way. And therefore, when I think John Duncan and other members of what became the Black Democrats Club, decades ahead of the large-scale shift of African Americans to the Democratic Party during the Roosevelt administration in the 30s, what they were thinking about were these types of issues. So I find it's interesting to note the highly localized and kind of the way that the black community is really involved and interested in local mining, industry, labor politics, where we tend to assume that everything that animates black political life in the early 20th century has to somehow be connected to kind of the national big questions. But here we find it's very interested in local issues. And from that, I don't think we know necessarily if Heinze actually did give any, because he won most of those elections in 1902. He won his court, he won most of the senators. The Congress did remain in Democratic hands, which kind of ensured that Clark, who had just become a senator, was not going to get pulled from office because he was unbelievably unpopular and corrupt. So it's difficult to know if there were major concessions made. I think not, though, because if you read accounts from John Duncan's children, they kind of see the next 20 years as incredibly isolated, leading up to the point in World War II in which they have made no gains in breaking into unions, which are still all white in their membership at this time. They're still not allowing black miners to go underground until World War II, which is still kind of a very painful part of their experience in Butte. So I suspect that not many concessions were made afterwards. Yeah, it's a good question, though. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Hi. I actually have a lot of questions, but
We can ask them all.
I'll just stick with the first one on my mind, which is, Butte is so often presented as a unique urban space and unique and sort of part of such a driver in a lot of the ways we think about Montana history. Mm-hmm. But you also brought up Denver, which had a very proactive Black community at the turn of the last century. And I'm wondering is it useful to try and compare a Colorado urban space to a Montana urban space? Or is it more useful to think of the Blacks in Butte in the context of Montana's other Black communities? And maybe they're all useful. Or I was just wondering if you thought much about that.
I think about this kind of stuff all the time. I'm really kind of obsessed with thinking about the different ways that kind of old school social historians either look at or ignore certain spaces based on how big they were or kind of industries they have. So I'm definitely on board with thinking about all the continuities and differences between spaces. For the useful part of this presentation where we're thinking about these Emancipation Day celebrations, I'm fascinated by the way that they begin in one very particular geographic location. They begin in eastern Oklahoma. They begin in incredibly, almost entirely rural agricultural communities. There's a few places like Boley, Oklahoma, which has a large Black town by the early 20th century. That kind of approaches what we would start thinking of as an urban space, especially after the kind of the oil glut of the early 1910s. But for the most part, these celebrations begin in rural places. And then we can go west and we can find them in truly urban metropolitan spaces like Denver or Seattle, in which the Black experience in these urban spaces, which has been well documented, has all types of nuances which historians just dig into, whether or not they're working in certain industries for how long, where they're living, where they're building neighborhoods, if they have minority representation in city politics. And yet these people are also getting on trains and, taking an excursion to Pikes Peak in, 1910 for their Emancipation Day celebration. And they'll also note some tiny little town, in the middle of the Central Rockies that is, a 6-hour train ride from everywhere. And they're having, had it been like a timber or mining community, and there must have been only a couple dozen Black residents in that city, and they're having a picnic. I have found them in Cheyenne and Pocatello, which are both like highly railroad-centric towns that have very close-knit Black communities, but also that work in the service industry. So you can go through and start seeing, by the time I get to Montana and I see that Butte seems like it's a really interesting place, the reason why we focus on it is because it has something that no other city, no other source has, and that's a description of what actually happens at an Emancipation Day celebration. In almost every single other case, it's just, this is the thing that we all do, and everyone knows it, and there's a big ad in the paper, come for the August 4th, get your tickets, we'll elect an Emancipation Day king and queen. That's usually the most detail you get. The fact that we got names, that we got, what, events were taking place, where they went, how they got there, that's kind of what makes Butte unique, and I don't think it's that Butte is so much different than perhaps Helena or Great Falls, which also had these celebrations and likely also did the exact same kind of events and activities. There is something interesting about the way that this takes. The reason we get this particular account is because it's happening in the midst of an incredibly divisive moment within the community. And this is a way that they kind of step back from what is a very contentious debate within the Black community, within social clubs and literary societies and all the things that they do on a daily and weekly basis. And everyone comes together, all, at this point they say almost over 200 people are getting on this train, which is a huge percentage of the community. They all come together and go out and have their picnic. So it's a moment of unity, but I think it's kind of expounded upon the way it was, precisely because it comes in the midst of a really divisive time. And there are certainly really divisive moments and times in other Black communities. Butte, because of its really kind of distinct labor and mining history, and it's this nationally, there are many, many books written on the battle for Butte, this particular moment in the early 1900s. I think that all kind of collides to a time where it's this story that a lot of Montanans know and cherish. I'm from Anaconda. I heard about this my entire life growing up. And then suddenly to realize that even within this history is another history which has kind of not been passed down and has become inoperative for some reason, that it's just not the narrative that we talk about. Those are the things that I'm fascinated with. And they often come out of thinking very critically about the difference between different cities and places. So, yeah, thank you.
This is maybe going to be a more bigger picture question, because I'm not as engaged with some of the subject matter here, but I'm trying to think of the best way to say this without coming across sounding like a jerk, because I don't mean it that way. But if you were like in an elevator with somebody and you had to say, this is why this matters, how would you articulate that? And the reason I'm I like how you just said there's this story that's become inoperative.
Yeah.
And honestly, I don't know a whole lot about the Indian Territory and the racial complicatedness that existed there. So if nothing else, like I'm sitting here thinking, man, we've all just inherited a wildly complicated country. And I know that's an understatement. And this just drove that home for me even more. So I guess that's kind of what I'm thinking is like, today we sit here, 2022, we have this inoperative story. We're also seeing Juneteenth getting more daylight than it probably ever has. So why does it matter? How would you articulate that? And if you just had somebody in that elevator, what's your elevator
I would start by
speech?
hitting all the buttons, so to make sure we have as much time as possible. Yes, I do. Yeah. I'm often, as is likely evident, I'm not a particularly brief person, but in thinking about like how would you express really quickly how this matters and why it matters, I think you would always begin by asking whoever you're speaking with, and kind of drawing out a likelihood that the history of a place where they live, especially a place like Montana, but really every place, this is not unique to Montana in any ways, has in all kinds of ways for their entire lives growing up and into adulthood continued to shape their sense of self and their identity as someone from or of a place. What is often kind of left to the side in those types of kind of the moments we have within ourselves when we think about like what does it really mean if we're a Montanan. Anytime someone introduces themselves to me as a fourth generation Montana, I know that matters to them, which tells me that this should also matter to them because I know that identity matters to them. And in this sense, my whole project for the last 7 or 8 years now has been to try and find ways to take moments and events that I know are part of really important identity building histories that matter to people's lives and show them to exist within this complicated world, but also one that has taken and has developed through processes that have dispossessed certain people, that have dispossessed indigenous nations across the American West, that have excluded and ostracized communities, and that have essentially put up innumerable cultural and social barriers to keep large, the growing communities of these early years in the 19th and 20th century from really establishing themselves within that society that also then pulls as heavily and consistently upon this place identity, which so many people have. And I think that when that happens, one, it's an immediately uncomfortable thing. It was for me, to things like, okay, my sense of self in this place is born out of a history which has all types of exclusions and racism that is kind of infused within these systems. But at the same time, then I also realize that if I don't understand those, I don't really know how it is that I have come to think of myself in this way, in this place. Not truly. I have a version of it, I have a narrative, but I'm someone I'm really interested in knowing how we have those narratives, where they connect with what we can see in the historical record. And I think that in my personal experience gives me a fuller kind of sense of self in this place, because it causes you to pause and contemplate and do all kinds of things that I think anyone is interested in doing. No one wants an uncritical identity that they hold for themselves. So I think that's part of why I think it continues to matter. And I'll say that, like, at this point they're off the elevator and I'm pulling them back in. But I'll say that it does continue to resurface in national politics and national conversations about race and equality that will continue on for the foreseeable future. As long as there are narratives which so fully kind of define someone's sense of self that are void of these types of histories, it gives an undue sense of security that, oh, that is somewhere else. That is a history that, is elsewhere and otherwise, and it's not the history that has built me, and I have this kind of insulation from these bigger problems, when in fact, people don't. And I think that a really important part of doing any type of historical work is to bring those realities to the fore so they can be, thought about and considered, cautiously and empathetically. So, yeah. Thank you. That's actually a wonderful question. So thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Anyone else? Excuse me. I have a question.
Yes.
I'm a native of Helena, and growing up, we had an African-American family in our school. And I noticed growing up and still living here that there don't seem to be as many African American residents because I rarely see somebody. In fact, I live in East Helena now, and there's a guy living in the next block up, but he seems to be reclusive. We don't see him out on the property very much, or, he gets in his car and leaves from where I'm located. I can see that. But I thought we back then included the African American in our school, like they were just a part of the school. We didn't segregate them and say, "Oh, you're African American," and it seems like it's more prevalent today, the awareness of the African American community and presence thereof. And I don't know if we're becoming more, it's been there the whole time, but I don't know if Helena is becoming part of that isolation of the African American population.
Well, it's actually kind of interesting because in the period that I was talking about, in the case of Butte, through up until probably 1916, 1917, the percentage of African Americans as a total of the population, percentage of the population in Helena was one of the highest in a major kind of a urban-ish kind of space. It's a town with more than 5,000 people. Almost 3.5%, 4% of the population was black. Also within these spaces, kind of going back to my obsession with demographics, when towns are much smaller geographically and you can find them and you look at the way that neighborhoods are built up and businesses work, you realize that any population of people who are easily identified, and in the early 1900s, this included African Americans, Chinese immigrants, Mexican American workers, Greek, Italian. I mean, you can name a lot of very kind of ethnically and racially conspicuous individuals are working and living throughout town in ways that are very visible. So we have to kind of do a weird reset if we're thinking about Helena today and then Helena of 100 years ago. To walk through the streets of Helena 100 years ago would have been today by our standards, an unbelievably more diverse city than it is right now. And that is, it actually is a more diverse city than it is right now. Helena has grown, and since the 1920s, the black population has not grown in step with that. And my book, I kind of take that as the question that everyone asks, like how and why has this happened, and what does that mean, to try and recreate some of this, what I think are very relevant cultural and social and political forces that are at play throughout the late 19th and early 20th century that lead to this happening. By the end of the 1910s, you have, in Montana especially, most cities and towns, really kind of intensive economic upheavals, labor unrest in the end of the century leading up to end of the decade leading up to World War I, massive drought across most of the arid West that really sends Montana and many other northwestern states into economic decline by 1926. I think almost half of the banks in Montana fail by that date, and that's 3 years ahead of the Great Depression. And then the Great Depression comes. And what I think we can always remember is that these are places that have very tight-knit communities, and throughout, if you go and read the histories and literature on Great Depression era communities, whether they're rural, agricultural, farming communities or communities like Butte, you do see that people band together and form networks of kinship and networks of support and to help people through incredibly difficult times. But also what you see is that African Americans are quite, consistently excluded from most of those networks which are built during these very difficult times. And my argument in the book is that we can see that coming. We can see that in all types of social developments, of cultural forms that become incredibly popular and prevalent. And so the fact that you have a space in the early 100 years ago that is more diverse than it is now is likely, I often think of it not as being the result of any individual or even community actions, but rather kind of the really systemic and socially infused ways that race continues to shape the ways that people all across the United States, in the American West and Montana as well, consider and think about who belongs and who does not. And in the end, we often think that maybe that's just somehow an unfortunate, but it doesn't have real effects. But in Montana, as everywhere, deciding who belongs and who does not has had historically and to the present continues to have very evident, and I think important consequences that we continue to see play out. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, we'd like to thank Anthony for his wonderful presentation, and I want to let you know that his book has sold out in the store. So if you would like a copy of his book, if you could please talk to Rod in the store, and he will get some more, and Anthony will autograph them for you. So thanks again.
Thank you.